Hi there, and welcome to my talk, Forging Accessibility Champions at Splash Damage. And just to provide you with a little bit of an introduction to myself, my name is Joseph Kulik, and I'm the Accessibility Program Manager over at Splash Damage. Previously, I was working in the games industry as a games user researcher. I have a background in psychology, and I'm also in the final stages of my PhD, which has been focused on game accessibility. This PhD work has been focused over the last 5 years on understanding the challenges that game developers experience in seeking to make accessible games, and that is something that I've fed through into my work as well. In this talk, I'll be going over one of those things, one of those kind of strategies that can help us make accessible games, and this is an Accessibility Champions program. So through this, I'll be going over one, establishing the need for a champions program within our studio, so kind of like how we motivated this need, how we made the decision that a champs program was the right path to pursue here. Two, what exactly is a champions program? What does this mean? And three, what our specific champions program looks like today, because these are really two different things. Like on the one hand, there are lots of champions programs that are out there, and in my experience, in my research, they can take many different forms. And three is kind of what we decided our champions program should look like, based on our needs and kind of our requirements internally. And finally, I'll be talking about our champions program in the future and how we measure the success of our champs program and things like that. Um, Here on out, I'll be referring to champions as champs because this is what we commonly refer to them internal to our studio, and it's just a little bit of easier shorthand. Establishing the need for a champs program. So before I tell you about our champs program, we need to talk about the challenges that the studio was encountering that led to the decision to start a champs program. Prior to Splash Damage, my PhD was focused on understanding the challenges that game developers experience in making accessible games. Some of this work was with Splash Damage directly, but a lot of it was with a wider game development community. And the challenges that game developers and Splash Damage was facing tie with many of the strategies that we're approaching to improve our ability to make accessible games. So, in terms of key challenges that the studio was facing, developers often said that they didn't really know who to speak to about accessibility. The UI team was relied upon disproportionately, doing a lot of the heavy lifting around accessibility, proportionate to other teams. There was also no explicit time or space to talk about accessibility very often, so people often felt they didn't really know not only who to speak to, but where it was they were supposed to bring up these issues or where it was they were supposed to have these conversations about accessibility features and things like that. They also often felt that it wasn't valued, so it wasn't part of their core work necessarily. It was something they had to do around that was separate and wasn't necessarily something they were being praised for. And they also felt that they often lacked knowledge and experience around accessibility. So both around accessibility, but also around disability. And these are all areas that the CHAMPS program has some capacity to help. Now, these challenges aren't universally encountered by all developers and studios. Most studios will already have accessibility advocates, and certain studios also have their own matured accessibility teams. There are big companies out there who have a wealth of accessibility knowledge internally. But if you're in the earlier stages or you don't have a dedicated accessibility hire, I think it's quite likely that your studio is experiencing some of these issues. Um, However, the one thing I will say, that doesn't mean there aren't accessibility advocates in your team. The Champions program doesn't make these advocates appear. The idea of it is it just champions them. It just encourages them and rewards them for the work that they're doing and helps them find a space where they can have productive conversations around accessibility and things like that. These are advocates already exist, what most likely already exist within the studio. But the problem with that is that without any structure and support, advocacy can be very taxing. It can feel like you're a very lonely initiative. It can feel like you're pushing for something that other people don't care about. And what you often encounter when you're kind of pushing for something, you're trying very hard for something that doesn't feel like it's being rewarded and other people don't care about, you often get people experiencing burnout. So that's kind of where Champs fits in. It's like we're not necessarily creating accessibility advocates, but we're providing this structured support system, this structured network that can bring them together and make them feel their work is rewarded and help spread their advocacy to more spaces and things like that as well. Now that we've gone over a lot of the big challenges that game developers often face in making accessible games, especially in relation to those that apply to things like a champs program, what we'll do is we'll go back to these at the end of the presentation and I'll kind of discuss how our Champs program seeks to fit in with these challenges and help our developers more successfully make accessible games. I also want to talk about this idea about accessibility as requiring some degree of cultural change. Accessibility considerations really need to be present across almost all the work that we do. And you saw on the previous slide that people felt that it was a problem if UI was relied upon too commonly or too heavily for accessibility. And that really is because accessibility needs to be rooted in all of the work that we're doing at a studio. It really is in gameplay, it's in art, it's in animation, it is in UI, but it's also in audio, it's also in HR, it's in all of the departments that work at your studio. Almost everything needs to make accessibility considerations. And that's very difficult to do purely through process documentation. If you can't manage that cultural shift, if you can't change the mindsets of people across a studio, you're often going to find that people are forgetting to make these accessibility considerations. You know, if you want a designer to be immediately thinking when they're constructing a feature, oh, what demands are is this placing on our players? How is this going to be affecting um, a certain person with a certain level of ability? How are they going to be able to play this game? That requires a certain degree of automaticity to their thinking, and that is what requires that shift in mindset. That is what requires that cultural change. So it goes more than just process, and that's really where we start talking about things like Champs programs. When we start talking about changing process, almost changing the values of a studio, and in kind of encouraging certain values of a studio to achieve a certain result. So we've talked about some of the challenges that our studio has been facing, and I think that helps contextualize why we're thinking about things like a Champs program. But what exactly is an Accessibility Champions program? Before shifting career towards game accessibility, I personally hadn't heard of an Accessibility Champions program. I hadn't been part of an Accessibility Champs program, and I certainly hadn't ran one. So, as a researcher, I kind of gathered all the information that was available online and kind of read through all the material that was already available. But also, I made sure to have conversations with people who were running Champs programs at different companies, both inside and outside of the games industry, and inside and outside of the tech industry, to learn more about how they were being ran. And I found a lot of similarities between them through that, but I also found a lot of differences as well. And that helped inform me about how we wanted to structure the program at Splash Damage. And, I found that there was a lot of similarity across different Champs programs. They had similar objectives in that they were designed to unite accessibility champions across different studios. And in some cases, this would be across a single studio. In some cases, it would be across many, many different departments and places of work across an entire country or space. And in other cases, it would be very small as well. So there's a really wide range of kind of reach there. The other objective that would tend to be pretty consistent was this idea of trying to ensure even representation, although the approach that different places took to achieve that was a little bit different in my conversations and research as well. Another factor was this idea of recognizing and rewarding people for kind of being interested in accessibility, being curious, and wanting to also celebrate the things that they achieved in that area too. And then finally, it was this idea of providing opportunities to learn. And this was a significant focus of lots of the Champs programs, but it's like just the idea that a lot of people come into Champs feeling that they don't, well, some people come into Champs because they're a very strong advocate in this space, but a lot of people also go into Champs because they want to learn more about accessibility. So it needed to be a space that was willing to kind of nurture people's knowledge too. However, the Champs programs at other studios and other businesses varied in a number of ways. One of the key ways in which they varied was in terms of openness, and this was the idea that they could sometimes be very open, where anyone could join, and in other cases they'd be more restrictive, where it was invite only. Maybe in some cases they could only join for a certain amount of time before they were rotated out. This was one of the key ways in which they varied, and this was a consideration that we were making with our own Champs program. Another was in regards to the commitments that were being made when you joined the Champs program. So some programs would have people, engage with meetings every 2 weeks. Maybe they'd be an hour or 2 hours long, and others would be once monthly, half an hour or an hour, a shorter period of time. In terms of flexibility as well, some programs would be very guided, where the program coordinator would come with a very specific thing they wanted to present in the meeting, and a lot of the time would be taken by that particular almost lecture style content, where they'd be teaching a particular thing or running a particular workshop. And in other cases, it'd be very, very flexible, where it was more focused on open discussion, and the discussion would be led by the champions themselves. An additional area in which it seemed that they varied was in regards to rewards and progression. In some programs, they had almost no explicit rewards, like no additional incentives in terms of like t-shirts and badges. Those things were less common. In other programs where I spoke to people, it was much more explicit how people would be rewarded and progress through the program. Some would have leveling systems and progression systems, and then those would be uh, layered with additional incentives like badges, t-shirts, rewards, and things like that as well. So there were kind of a wide variety of ways in which these champion programs would vary. And all of these different features that other champs programs helped me decide what I thought was best for our studio, with the resources that we had, with the kind of structure of the company and the kind of level of accessibility maturity, things like that as well. And I made a decision based on those factors. And one of the things was that I wanted the program to be open to everyone. So I didn't want anyone that was feeling like, oh, I really want to level up my accessibility knowledge, or I really want to have more conversation about accessibility. I didn't want them to be left out because we had any restrictions on the number of participants that could join, or if there were too many people in a discipline, I didn't want to lock them out of the champs program or anything like that. So that was a big factor, I think, in the decision making there. I also wanted it to be a regular but small commitment. And the idea of this really was that, I understood that with a number of different teams and disciplines and things like that, then you're all going to have different commitments already. You're going to have like very intense periods some of the time, and other times you're going to have a lighter workload and things like that too. I wanted to create something that really could fit with as most people as possible, with the idea that the most important thing really was to get them regularly thinking about accessibility, because I think that's the important factor in working to change mindsets is get that regularity there. Start to encourage a pattern of thinking where it feels like accessibility has a place in conversation at the studio. Hopefully not just in our champs program, but extending out of that as well. I also wanted these sessions to be guided by myself. So they had some degree of structure. So we had some information that I was bringing to every session. So there was some reason for people to turn up and learn something and gain some new knowledge, either externally or internally. But also, I wanted the sessions to be driven by our champions. So if they had questions, if they had things they wanted to pull up into our champs program, then that's what we were going to encourage as well. I also wanted to offer some degree of rewards and incentives. I didn't want this to be overboard, because obviously this is a certain time commitment on the accessibility program manager's part as well. So I didn't want this to be a 40-hour per month responsibility. I wanted it to be something that was manageable within the rest of my workload. So I didn't want to have like 5 degrees of different levels of a champion that you could work through, because that involves a lot of tracking, a lot of progression of rewards, a lot of monitoring and things like that, which I not what I wanted at this stage. But I did want champions to feel rewarded, so we have planned rewards in the longer term for people who are participating in our champs program. And these would range from, small little things like badges on Slack to larger things. So that's kind of explained some of the kind of research and the kind of background I did before constructing the champs program over at Splash Damage. And now we're going to talk about what form our champions program took. So just to provide an overview of what the Accessibility Champions program at Splash Damage is, it's a network of accessibility advocates that are a voice for inclusion and accessibility throughout our games and our studio. So it's not just limited to our games necessarily. It can be HR and those other processes as well. They're also committed to helping us develop inclusive games, building accessibility knowledge, and supporting teams. And like I say, I say games here, but it's not just a commitment to developing inclusive games. It also extends to other areas of the business as well. And they're also supported by the Accessibility Program Manager, as well as a network of other accessibility champions. So this means being able to go to meetings and raise issues, get help from other champions, as well as myself. And we host a 1-hour monthly meeting to discuss accessibility at the studio. This features internal accessibility news and announcements, external accessibility news, roundtable style discussions, and opportunities to ask questions and chat with other champs about accessibility. In terms of the balance in those different areas, I would say maybe the first 15 or 20 minutes are more structured, and then the kind of following 30 to 40 minutes are more open-ended with semi-structured questions or entirely open-ended questions, depending on what people bring to the table. And we're going to go over our champs program in detail in relation to goals, the traits of our champions, and what we're looking for when kind of getting people into the champs program, the commitments required for our champions, and the benefits and support that our champions receive. In terms of the goals at the studio, one of the key goals was around spreading awareness of accessible design throughout the studio. So the idea of embedding these champions, these kind of sources of knowledge throughout their teams, it means that people can go to these people and they know who to go to when they have an accessibility question. They know who the accessibility champion on their team is, and they can reach out to them, who ends up spreading knowledge about accessibility in relation to their discipline to the people that are working on that team. It also was a goal that these champions would help spearhead accessibility features throughout our games. That means having people present in meetings, asking about the status of different accessibility features, asking about the priority of certain features, and maybe why one feature was prioritized over another, why accessibility feature maybe isn't being prioritized, and things like that. Having those people there to ask those questions, I think, is really important because as an accessibility program manager working in a company that technically employs around 500 people, I think then it's very difficult to be present in all meetings, and certainly impossible to be present in all meetings and all conversations. It's just not the case that I can be present in all of these design conversations. And obviously, some process-related changes help with this, but also embedding these champions and sources of knowledge throughout different teams is a big help as well. And the other factor is this idea of educating and inspiring others, because in the longer term, we want more advocates, we want more champions, we want more people to be knowledgeable about accessibility, and we either want more or we want it to be to such a high standard that it doesn't really feel that anyone stands out as an accessibility champion and everyone is an advocate for accessibility. Everyone recognizes the importance around accessibility. And we also wanted to reduce the distance between developers and people with accessibility knowledge. So that didn't necessarily mean that we had even representation, but the goal really is to get some degree of representation across all of our teams and departments at the studio. We also want to spotlight and celebrate accessibility work. We want people to feel that it's valued at the company and they're being praised for doing good work in this area. And that's one avenue where the Champs program helps, is that we want to kind of talk about each other's work and celebrate it. And we also want to provide support for people who are experiencing challenges in their work around game accessibility. So that means, if you come to the Champs program and you have a particular difficulty that you're having, maybe it's another champion that jumps in and says, hey, I experienced the same thing, or I experienced a similar thing. Or maybe it's something that we take offline and we don't know the solution to right there, or we don't have anything quite compatible that we can transfer knowledge from. But we can say, hey, well, I know how we can approach this, and I know who we can speak to at the studio to tackle this challenge. There's lots of different avenues that we can provide support for people at the studio and in the Champs program when they're talking about the accessibility difficulties that they're having. We also wanted to be clear that the Champs program is open to everyone that wants to learn more about accessibility and has an interest in accessibility and inclusivity. You don't need to know everything in these topics, but you must have an interest in wanting to learn more. So you must have a curiosity about these topics and interest professionally in these topics to kind of want to participate in the program. I mean, it's not very likely we'd have anyone sign up that isn't interested in it or anything like that. And actually, we want to foster that interest in people before they join the program. So even if people are, disinterested in accessibility, that's something that I'm trying to encourage anyway. But it's a given that the members of the Champs program, generally speaking, will be people that have an interest in this, want to learn more, and things like that as well. So, but the main point here is that we don't really want to exclude anyone from the Champs program. If you're joining the Champs program, you've accepted that you want to learn something about accessibility, and we'll kind of meet you where you're at and build from there. And I've highlighted this one before, probably even a couple of times, but I think it is really important because there are departments where people think accessibility isn't relevant to them. Like maybe you're an artist or something like that, and you just don't think accessibility is relevant to you. Or maybe you don't work in anything that touches the game, and you're only thinking about accessibility in terms of our products. You're not really thinking about accessibility in terms of our studio and things like that too. But that's not true. Like, maybe it's the case you work in the creative services department or something like that, and you're producing graphics for our internal teams, or maybe you're working on internal communications or anything like that. And accessibility is extremely relevant to these departments as well. And we want to encourage everyone to take part, really. We want to encourage all of these departments to learn more about accessibility, and that is what is helping change our culture, because it's not just something we're thinking about in this particular area of the game when this particular process tells us to. It's something that we're taking from end to end throughout the entire company. In terms of the commitments of our champions, we expect people to attend the monthly champions meeting, which is 1 hour per month. And I do understand that this isn't always possible, that sometimes people have booked holidays and things like that, then they might not be able to attend. But generally speaking, we want to encourage a regular attendance, so it's something you kind of do spend that hour on once per month. We also want people to speak up about accessibility. At the same time, I do understand that this can be difficult. It can be difficult if you're the only person in the room willing to speak up about a particular topic. But that's kind of like the commitment we want from our champions. They're people willing to say something when something is wrong around accessibility. They're people who are willing to advocate and learn about accessibility. So they're willing to be present as an advocate in their meetings and things like that. Obviously, it is still the case that if you wanted to join Champs just to learn, and I don't want to exclude people if they're more anxious or anything like that. I don't want to exclude people on the basis that they have to be outspoken, because I understand that some people can't be. But that's the kind of attitude we want to foster. We do want to foster people being willing to, even if it sends someone a message. Like we've had things come up where people have said to me, "Oh, I don't, I want to be part of Champs, but I don't want to have to present something. I don't want to have to talk about my work and things like that because I'm not really used to talking about my work in front of groups of people." And I would say, "Oh, don't worry about that. If you have anything you want to bring up, let me know, and then I'll do it." So there are different avenues to kind of speak up, I think, too. Like it doesn't have to be, you stand up in a meeting in front of your boss and tell them that what they're doing is wrong because it's not accessible. It can also be, you send the accessibility program manager a message and you say, I'm concerned about this particular feature. Is there anything you could do to speak to this person, help us make it more accessible? And then that could be an approach as well. The other factor, as I mentioned, is advocate and learn. So it's commitment to learning more about accessibility. In terms of the benefits, you get to be part of a friendly and supportive community at the studio. The conversations we have in the champs meetings, I think, are very positive and productive, and it's just a nice meeting to be a part of. We're very open to other people's ideas and things like that. Like it's not a meeting where you're going to be dismissed in any capacity. So I think that's a good kind of attitude to foster there, and I think that makes people want to participate and want to kind of share ideas in that space. It's also the fact that you get support in overcoming barriers and challenges that you're experiencing in your own work from the accessibility program manager. And of course, this is also available to other people at the studio, but it's a space to express those concerns. It's a space to express if you're experiencing a challenge and you need support, and then get that immediately on a regular basis. And we also provide priority access to training and resources around accessibility, things like attendance to the Game Accessibility Conference. That is something that we prioritize our champions for, because we want to reward people for making a commitment towards accessibility. So, if you're already committing time at the studio, and then you want to learn more, you want to invest more in your skills in that area, then we think that makes sense because you're positioning yourself as an advocate in the studio. So it makes sense to invest in you and empower you as an advocate in that area. So it makes sense you get priority access to the training and things like that as well. And that doesn't mean that training isn't available for other people too. If they need accessibility training, that absolutely will be made available to them. But it's just that priority access is for people who are in the Champs program. And in terms of the benefits, additional benefits, I guess, in terms of explicit rewards, we're looking into accessibility branded merchandise. This is still a work in progress. We haven't delivered anything on this front yet, but we have things like an accessibility logo, and we have the template for things like pin badges and T-shirts and things like that. They're definitely things that are within scope for us to provide to our accessibility champions. That's something that we want to do in the future to reward people for participating over time. And the other factor is that accessibility is a serious area of professional development that many companies value highly. I think there are a lot of companies that take accessibility very seriously. And if you say, look, I'm a game designer and I also have a lot of experience with accessibility, I think that's a way to enhance your skill set and make yourself more employable. So I think that that's a big benefit to joining the Champs program and investing in your own learning and development around that topic that's important to your area of work. If you review the challenges that we found around a lot of developers who were experiencing difficulty making accessible games, then the Champs program provides a clearer source of accessibility knowledge. It embeds people with that knowledge into teams and clearly identifies who those people are. So it helps in that sense. And it also builds up knowledge over time as you attend the Champs meetings and get exposed to more and more information, both externally and internally, around accessibility. It also provides a regular space to talk. So that's in relation to the idea that people didn't know where they could talk about accessibility. It doesn't mean this is the only space that accessibility should be featured in conversation, obviously not, but it provides a regular space. It normalizes these conversations around accessibility, and it helps them more readily extend into the rest of the studio. It creates this culture and this mindset where it's normal and typical to talk about accessibility. And we have people of all levels of seniority taking part in the champs program. We might have someone like a creative director in the champs program, and they're talking with someone on the design team or something like that, and they wouldn't normally have a conversation about accessibility, right? But they have it in champs, and it extends beyond that, and they can pick up that conversation elsewhere and things like that too. So champs also help celebrate and recognize the value of people's accessibility work. As I mentioned before, the difficulty there was that people didn't necessarily feel that they were being valued for the work they were doing in that area. So champs helps with that a little bit, and it helps recognize the value of the work there. We also can celebrate some of the work beyond champs as well. So we don't just want to only celebrate in champs. We also want to spotlight that work in other areas as well. It means that everyone in champs is aware of that work, and that means I can then go into another channel in our Slack or something like that and say, look at this really great bit of accessibility work that relates to UI or art or anything like that, and help them kind of celebrate that there as well. Champs also helps us build knowledge around accessibility, and again, that it's not just about the building knowledge. Sorry, it's not just about the sources of accessibility knowledge, but it's also about building it over time. So it's two factors really there. It's like the availability and the actual acquisition of that knowledge, and Champs helps us with that because you're learning more by participating in the Champs program. So that's really the Champs program as it stands at Splash Damage, and I just want to talk about the future and the related initiatives a little bit as well. Ultimately, the Champions program will evolve with the studio and the needs of the people that are participating in the Champions program. So that means that it might change. It might not always be the same structure of internal, external news and open discussion. It might be the case that people feel they really want a 30-minute little workshop on a particular task, or it might be the case that the champs program is just fueling initiatives outside of it. It might be the case that we stick with a similar structure, but people are saying, oh, we need this workshop or we need this educational resource, and that's something that I can invest time into. In the future, I hope to get guest speakers involved in our champs program and pull more lived experience of disability into our champs meeting, because I think those are amazing sources of insight for our developers to learn from, and that aligns with some of the challenges that game developers face as well. And I also think that the feedback will help us. The feedback that developers provide from our meetings will help us shape the future of our champs meetings. So it ends up being quite circular in that sense. But the Champions program also guides our other initiatives. For instance, I touched upon this a little bit on the previous slide, but something that comes up in the champs meeting maybe isn't something we can resolve on the spot. Maybe it's an area of knowledge that they feel is missing, and it's something that not just that person feels is absent, but a number of the team or a number of people from different teams feels that they could benefit from. And then maybe that leads to the development of a new workshop or course or something like that we can help with. It might also be that some of the barriers are related to processes, and it's something that we can invest in towards process change instead. So again, it's this idea that it's not necessarily the case that the champs meetings have to actively resolve all the problems that people raise. The champs meetings provide a pulse of accessibility at the studio, and as the accessibility program manager, I can then go behind the scenes and help resolve some of those issues for the studio and to change our process and culture to make it easier for us to make more accessible games. One final thing I think it's important to talk about is that if we're talking about cultural change being required to make accessible games successfully, then we're also talking about things like change management practices, like how are we planning and measuring while we make changes. And I think there's a few things just on that I want to touch upon very briefly. So things like our attendance to the champs meetings, like how many people are attending each meeting, um, feedback forms and things like that. So we'll send feedback forms out on a semi-regular basis just to get people's thoughts on the champs meetings, to get insight on whether they thought anything could be done differently. We're also always accepting informal feedback. Like people can always speak to me at any point, and that's always expressed. If they have any questions or have any concerns, people can go to me. That includes the champs program. People often speak in the champs program openly anyway as well. So if they have something they want to talk about that we're not talking about, they'll raise it there. But there's always opportunities to provide feedback outside of that privately too. And we also have our accessibility culture survey or accessibility process survey. and that measures accessibility initiatives across a variety of matters that affect culture and process. Brilliant. And thank you very much for listening to me for 30 minutes. If you have any questions, remember that you can ask them on the dedicated channel on the Discord. And also, if you're attending the event in person, feel free to just walk up to me and have a chat. Thank you and goodbye.